on Sky News Australia. This is the Rita Panahi Show Overtime.
Welcome to the Rita Panahi Show Overtime. Coming up on today's program, we'll be speaking to a female MMA fighter who fought a transgender woman, and what's more, she wasn't even told she'd be fighting a natural-born biological man. That incredible story shortly. Also today, we'll be speaking to Rabbi Shmuley about the latest on the Israel-Hamas conflict, and also about an almighty TV clash he had with Cenk Uygur. I'll be crossing to the UK to speak with Darren Grimes about Suella Braverman being dumped and the sorry state of the so-called Conservative Party. And of course, we won't forget your favourite segment, Lefties Losing It. But let's start the show with the latest news with Kosha Gator. Kosha, thank you so much for your time. Let's start with the terrible state of academia, and it's not just universities, but the indoctrination in primary and secondary schools. The Herald Sun reports students skipping school to attend a national climate rally will have access to a medical certificate signed by professors from two leading Australian universities, which says a major climate health concern is preventing them from being in the classroom. The certificate also says the students are experiencing symptoms of increased anxiety, elevated stress, and feelings of despair. And thus their doctor recommends they take a sick day to protest for a sick planet. University of Melbourne and Australian National University climate scientists David Carrolley and Nick Abel have signed this mock certificate, which students can download. I mean, really. But the line there about anxiety and stress, that's actually real. These privileged kids living in the most prosperous country at the best possible time in history are actually mentally ill, some of them seeking treatment because of this climate anxiety.
And so many other things. The whole mental illness epidemic is real. And you're right, if you just look at it objectively, these are the last people in human history who probably should be, and yet they are. And of course, nothing helps cure anxiety, despair, and stress than taking a day off school and pretending that you're saving the world, which is what some of them probably think they're doing with this protest. I think there's also a final sort of meta point about the education sector. And when it is something that has been propped up the way it has, where there's fake demand effectively for these degrees or school, and the pipeline kind of continues, they have so many regulatory advantages, we shouldn't be surprised when they flex their muscle a little bit by having these downloadable documents, and we might see more and more of that.
And I'm going to be talking to Rabbi Shmuley later in the program about another student protest, this time for the Palestinian cause, anti-Israeli protest, if you want to call it that. Again, in Victoria, surprise, surprise. Now, Kosha, it appears Australians are deeply divided when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war. A new Roy Morgan survey released today shows that 51% believe that Israel should remove its army immediately from Gaza, citing concerns about the disproportionate impact on civilians, the humanitarian crisis, and the high number of civilian casualties, while those against the immediate removal of the Israeli army cite the Hamas still holding innocent hostages and saying that the release must only come with Hamas's defeat, and Israel has a right to defend itself. What do you make of this data? Are you surprised by the percentage who do want Israel to withdraw from Gaza? To me, that's a sign that the Hamas is winning the PR war.
I'm not actually that surprised. On first blush, one would think it's surprising, but we've arrived at this moment, and there's a few layers of things that I think are shaping that. One is the consequence of immigration. And we've talked about this before, that if you have a society now where there are factions or different ethnic enclaves that might be sympathetic to other issues, or they're importing their own allegiances here in this country in a way that is maybe incongruent with what it would have been 30 or 40 years ago, we can't be surprised in a way that those people are making up that 51%. I think the media is shaping the narrative as well in some way, and there is a sympathetic picture being painted on the opposite side. And then I also think as time elapses between that initial atrocious attack that happened in the south of Israel And now the fog of war dissipates and people do start to ask some of these nuanced questions of, what is the proportionate response? What should Israel be doing? It's happened before. Every time they're attacked unprovoked and then they defend themselves, this happens again and again. And so in a way, I'm not surprised.
Yes, but I just thought at the start of this conflict where the goal of eliminating Hamas completely, that this wasn't going to be like the previous conflicts, this was going to end Hamas, but that doesn't seem to have resonated with many people, because you are seeing these horrific pictures out of Gaza and you are having the Israelis held accountable for that rather than Hamas, who's putting their headquarters in hospitals, for example. Now, this is a story that's a little bit lighter and brighter. Frankly, I think it's a little bit delicious. Herald Sun reports that former Premier Dan Andrews, Victorian Premier, well, his desire to join the Portsea Golf Club is in serious doubt as members revolt against the man who inflicted 6 lockdowns on the state. They don't want him to be part of their exclusive club, Kosher. This is despite Dan's high-flying business mate, billionaire Max Beck, quietly approaching Portsea Golf Club power brokers to try to get the former Premier in. I tell you, instant karma gets you eventually. It will get you eventually. And Dan here, he's a keen golfer. This is going to hit hard.
I think it is. I think delicious was a good way to describe it. It's a reminder of, the way he and the administration conducted itself during COVID. He's not alone in that. There's plenty of blame to be passed around governments of all stripes all around the world. It was the biggest roll-up of power in human history. But secondly, we live in a time where politicians seem to be beyond reproach or beyond consequence, and they fail upwards. There's so many examples of this. And there is something about this. It's a little vestige of power. It has its own rules, its own system. They don't fall under that rubric. And, they're flexing their muscle and saying you will have a consequence, and we don't share your views or agree with how you conducted yourself, and here you go.
It is. And that's the thing with those private clubs. It doesn't matter how powerful you were. It doesn't matter how many friends you've got in high places. It's not going to be a guarantee into entering the Portsea Golf Club. Now, Kosher, I'm not sure if you're aware of MrBeast. He's a YouTube star, real name Jimmy Donaldson, and he's come under fire, incredibly, for his philanthropic work. He is funding projects in Africa, 100 wells to be built that will bring clean drinking water to 500,000 people. Let's have a look.
Of 100 wells we're going to build in this video. Oh, water! You just witnessed a small village in Kenya get access to unlimited clean drinking water in less than a second. One down, 99 more wells in Africa to go.
But proving that no good deed goes unpunished, he's been criticised by some activists for this work. Yahoo had a piece noting that while American YouTuber MrBeast's goal was to provide clean drinking water for 500,000 people, activists say his actions shamed the Kenyan government and helped perpetuate the stereotype that Africa is dependent on handouts and the whole optics of a white guy coming in and saving the day. I wonder though whether this just exposes how hopeless so many governments are, NGOs, charities, in actually getting things done when this YouTuber can come in with limited resources and have such a dramatic impact.
It does. I think there's probably personal shaming that happened. I think there were some people quoted that they've been trying to do it for 15 years and never got anywhere, and he did it in less than a minute, as he said. I think the other thing too about the white male coming in and saving the oppressed, that whole thing, they need to just get out of the way, because what he is a beneficiary of a unique time and an unprecedented time in history because of the internet, because of anybody with access to the internet and a device can get out there and create a platform. He's the second most subscribed platform, over 200 million people on YouTube. That is the resource and the power that he has to bring attention to the issue. Doesn't matter what the color of his skin is, he's putting it to good use. There are many other far more narcissistic people on YouTube, and we should be thankful that he's doing something.
And sure the people who are benefiting from clean water are not too concerned about his skin colour or his gender or his sexuality. Now, whilst the other Republican candidates were analysing their debate performance, former US President Donald Trump, flanked by Tucker Carlson, Dana White, Kid Rock and Don Jr. received a rousing reaction from the Madison Square Garden crowd for UFC 295. Let's have a quick look.
His way into the building. One of the bigger mixed martial arts fans I know, President Donald Trump, taking his octagon side seat for UFC 295. Title fights coming up at UFC 295 here in a matter of moments, live from Madison Square Garden. And President Trump will be here to witness all of it. 4 of the very best fighters in the world.
Now, even I was surprised he got such a positive reaction in New York, of all places, but it is the UFC.
It is a UFC. That is his base personified, for sure. But it is interesting, though. I think you're touching on something very astute there, Rita. It is New York. It is his hometown. He was loved for many, many, many years until he entered the crazy world of politics. He is cool. Like, even people who hate him can't deny they hate that about him, but they can't deny you're walking in flanked by Kid Rock and Dana White. Yeah. There is some, and he just seems cool as a cucumber, even though he's got 4 lawsuits against him. He might well end up in jail. His companies are being, run into bankruptcy and everything else. And yet there he is with kind of that cool factor. And I think that's contagious in a way, so people applauded.
Now it's time for Lefties Losing It. And let's start in New York City. We saw those scenes of jubilation with Trump entering Madison Square Garden to watch UFC 295. Everyone was having a great time except one sad sorry. Karen, Bill Burr's wife. Let's have a look at her reaction. Oh dear, that ain't gonna help her husband's career. He may be a closet lefty himself, but Bill Burr's comedy is really too risque for the Democrat voting crowd. I'd say, Kosher, 80% of his audience would be centre-right or right. And what his wife pulled there, I just don't think is good for his brand. Did she just Bud Light him? Did she just Bud Light him? Her name's Nia Renee Hill.
She might have, and not to mention it wasn't very classy,
no.
that gesture. But in fairness, I think Bill Burr is in an impossible position, increasingly for the reasons you cite. If he's who he is inside, if that doesn't line up with his brand of comedy and where his audience is, at some point something might give, and maybe it's just her.
Yeah, much of his comedy I can't even play for you because it is fairly risque and completely non-PC. Interestingly, though, Bud Light has had to go to the UFC to save themselves because they tried to relaunch and it just was not working. And so they have gone to the most sort of right-wing, non-politically correct company they can think of and partnered with Dana White and the UFC. So we'll see if that saves Bud Light. Now let's go to another clip featuring our friend Billboard Chris, who is asked here to explain what trans is by a trans person who then flips out because the question he asked is being answered.
What does it mean to be trans?
I don't know. I've never
He's asking you.
can get an answer to that question.
I'm asking you.
Well, you just claimed you're trans,
I am trans.
and I'm asking you what that means.
What does it mean to you?
Well, I would tell you that transition is something
Don't
you do.
tell me. Wait, you don't tell anybody.
Okay, well, you asked what it means.
You literally just asked us to tell you what it means.
You can't win with these people. Now, here is a Lefties Losing It blast from the past. It features Ben Shapiro being threatened with bodily violence for asking a trans woman about their genetics.
Genetics? Would you like to discuss the genetics? Or no?
Well, no,
what
no.
are your genetics?
So I'd stay away from the genetics and back to the brain scans.
You cut that out now, or you'll go home in an ambulance.
Yeah, that seems mildly inappropriate for a political discussion.
So that was some 8 years ago, and watch how instead of calling out that threat of violence that he'll go home in an ambulance, the other panellists lay into Ben Shapiro for being rude and provoking the threats he suffered. Talk about victim blaming.
No, I know. Well, but wait. To be fair, but to be fair, you're actually being kind of rude. And that's not fair.
I'm sorry, it's not rude to say that someone who's biologically a male is a male. Someone who's biologically male is a male.
But Mr. Shapiro, you knew very well that saying that to Zoe would be egregiously insulting.
Now let's go to global warming darling Greta Thunberg. She was giving a speech at a major climate protest in Amsterdam, but she was disrupted by an stage invader who was unhappy with the shift of focus away from environmental issues onto Palestine. Let's have a look at what happened.
We have not been listening. The people in power have not been listening.
I come here for a climate demonstration, not a political view.
Calm down. No climate justice on occupied land. No climate justice on occupied land.
Kosher, what do you make of that? Greta Thunberg is branching out. Climate change is not enough now. She's Middle East politics expert now. Is she going to address the UN on that too?
She just might. We're seeing this mashup of all these issues happening, and their paradox, I think, is so thick you can cut it with a knife in a lot of those things. And she just might be finding that that's where the hot, galvanizing kind of interest is right now, and maybe she needs to latch onto that to either resuscitate the climate brand or just connect them together and get some more momentum.
And finally, it doesn't get much worse than this. An anti-Israeli crowd decided to hold a protest in the Melbourne suburb of Caulfield, where more than 40% of the residents are Jewish. They did it on the Sabbath, and they did it outside a synagogue.
Oh, the pepper spray's out! Stay back! Stay back! Shame on the police! Shame on Victoria! Shame on them! Show them who came in! Show them!
Kosher, ugly scenes. South Caulfield Synagogue had to be evacuated, and we saw the clashes there between the pro-Israeli and anti-Israeli crowd.
We have ugly scenes. They know exactly what they're doing, why they chose that day. And I think the sad thing is there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. We don't see any crackdown or law and order or anything like that being brought to bear. And I don't know where this ends, but it's not pretty.
Kosher Gator, thank you so much for your time today. Our next guest, Ansley Wilk, helped force a rule change by taking a principled stand. She is a mixed martial arts fighter, and she refused to fight trans women, natural-born biological males identifying as women. And that saw the North American Grappling Association announce a major policy overhaul, preventing trans-identifying men from competing against women in its competitions. I'm delighted to say Ansley Wilk joins me now. Ansley, it wasn't just you who had an issue here. The New York Post reported female fighters were terrified of facing men, and they were pulling out of competitions.
Yeah, we had multiple girls pull out of this just because we knew who they were now. And, you know, in the beginning, we weren't thinking about, oh, are we having to fight a male? And then you go on their Instagram and see them getting married as a man, and you're like, hey, wait, that's not okay.
Well, absolutely. Now, back in July, you weren't even told that you would be fighting a biological man identifying as a woman. Tell me when you found out, and what was your reaction when you got that news?
So my little brother kept asking me, like, are you fighting a man? And, like, we're not trying to be rude in the matter. Like, we accept you for who you are, but you can't just sneak in. And everything would have been okay had we had a warning and things could have been worked out. Like the rules stated, they should be transparent about their status because some girls are okay with competing with trans people, but some aren't because there's obvious injury that could happen.
Oh, absolutely. Did you consider pulling out of that fight at all? What was your? How did you come to the decision to go ahead?
Yeah, I still wasn't aware.
So until you were face to face?
Not even when I was face to face, really. I was still kind of suspect, but I wasn't 100% sure because, you know, people are going to get mad if you assume or ask. So we did a little social media digging after, and we figured it out when we saw a picture of them getting married as a man in 2020.
Wow. So even during the fight, you had your suspicions, but you weren't 100% sure. And yeah, in this environment, I can understand why you didn't want to ask. Now, let's have a quick look at some of that fight. The size difference here is notable, but I've got to say, you had this competitor down and submitting in no time.
Yeah. Watch your back. You need to let go of that left collar. Watch your back.
Well, no, not to mess with you. That competitor was tapping out very, very enthusiastically indeed. Now, you faced a bit of a backlash for simply talking about your experience and concerns. Tell me about some of the vitriol you've copped over this issue.
Yeah, so the backlash is pretty much just saying, you won, why do you have an issue with this? Even though I've stated a million times it was never about me. I clearly beat them. That's not my issue. The issue is that there are girls that are legitimately afraid. And they should not have to be afraid when they're seasoned competitors going into this. Like, they've done this hundreds of times. They know what they're doing. And the girls I've talked to that also experienced this said they have never felt so unsafe in a grappling match.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is full contact physical battle, and male bodies have such a significant advantage. So those trans identifying women can still compete, but they will be competing against the men going forward, not against women. But you've also had fantastic support. I know Riley Gaines, the swimmer, spoke out about your brave stance. And also Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling said this about you. She said, "You've done nothing wrong. This isn't and never was about hate. It's about fairness and safety for women and girls. You stood up to protect your fellow athletes, which makes you a heroine in all sane people's eyes. I know backlashes aren't fun. Believe me, I know, but there are things far more important than pleasing all the people all the time. All power to you." That's quite an endorsement there, Ansley.
That honestly meant the world to me as like a lifelong Harry Potter fan, and it's not something I ever expected. I never expected this to even go viral. I posted just trying to kind of get the situation out there, but I never expected it to be this big. But the support over the hate has been amazing. And I just have to look at the people that are endorsing me in this and know that I'm on the right side of history.
Well, you're on the right side of history, and I would say you're backed by 80% of people, if not more. It's just that activist lobby is particularly loud. They can be particularly vicious, and when you're hit with that, it can be quite overwhelming. But what advice do you have for female athletes who may face unfair fights, things that they know aren't right against biological male bodies, but they're too scared to speak up for themselves? I've had many contact me, retired and current athletes, who care about this issue, but they do it off the record because they are scared of that backlash.
I mean, you can still anonymously speak out and still make a change. The biggest thing isn't even so much the ladies putting in the work, because I believe that the ladies are putting in the work to make this change. It's the men that say, this is in the women's hands. No, you have wives, sisters, daughters. Like, you should be speaking out on the behalf of your family that you care about and their fairness and equality in sports.
Absolutely. I think it has to be a united stance. Ansley Wilk, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Joining me now is author and broadcaster Rabbi Shmuley. Now, we've got Israeli tanks reportedly reaching Gaza City's largest hospital, Al-Shifa, where around 650 patients are trapped amid gunfire exchanges between Hamas and the Israeli army. The IDF says the Palestinian terror group is using the hospital as a cover for its command post in underground tunnels, elevating it as a top target in Israel's efforts to eradicate Hamas. It comes as Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong has called for a ceasefire and also called on Israel to stop attacking hospitals. She said, "We do call on Israel to cease the attacking of hospitals." She added she understood that Hamas is burrowed into civilian infrastructure. But she went on to say, I think the international community, looking at what is occurring at hospitals, would say to Israel, these are protected facilities, protected under international law. Rabbi, what is your response to Australia's Foreign Minister, Penny Wong?
If they're protected under international law, then why didn't Australia, since there's been 4 wars already between Hamas and Israel, why didn't Australia object to Hamas violating that international law by making the Shifa Hospital into a military base? Let's just think about this. The Shifa Hospital essentially has a thin veneer of incubators and a thin veneer of ICU units, but 90% of it is underground. It is a military base designed to protect terrorists so they can murder Jews, kill Jews, annihilate Israel, exterminate Jews, and perpetrate a second Holocaust. The fact that the world has allowed Hamas to do this for 15 years as they have brutalized the Palestinians, as they have established a dictatorship, the fact that Western alliances are only waking up after 1,400 Jews are murdered and telling Israel, even then, you can't defend your people, is shocking 75 years after the Holocaust. Rita, you and I spoke a few days ago. 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the beginning of the Holocaust. What is the world's problem about Jews just living safely and securely? What is it about Australia that you have an issue with us protecting ourselves? Australia has a massive Jewish community. Well, I mean, 100,000 is pretty big for our small numbers, most of whom are Holocaust survivors. So stop the immoral pronouncements to Israel that they should allow a Hamas command and control center, a terrorist base under a hospital to go untouched.
Now, Rabbi, I want to play you a video of a mother whose daughters watched their father be murdered by Hamas and were then kidnapped and taken into Gaza. Their names are Daphna, who's 15, and Ella, who's 8. And here their mother begs to take their place.
אני קוראת לנשיא ארצות הברית ג'ו ביידן ולראש ממשלת ישראל בנימין נתניהו, אם אתם לא מצליחים להחזיר את הבנות שלי עכשיו, אני מבקשת מכם, אני מתחננת בפניכם, קחו אותי אליהם עכשיו, תכניסו אותי לעזה, אני אהיה החטופה ה-243. רק שאוכל להחזיק אותם ולהגיד להם.
Rabbi, it's heartbreaking, but this is a plight hundreds of families are going through, and the focus on the hostages seems to have been entirely lost. I know there's the posters that are going up and people are tearing them down, but beyond that, we're not really hearing much about these people who we don't know what they're suffering. We don't even know if they're still alive, where they are, and what they're enduring.
We knew, unfortunately, Rita, that aside from broadcasters like yourself, we Jews knew that after the worst act of violence and murder against Jews since the Holocaust, we knew that the world would focus on it for about a week or two, if that. Jewish life has been cheap for 2,000 years. None of us will ever get fully to the demonic forces that drive anti-Semitism. But Jewish life is so cheap. All of the suffering of my Palestinian brothers and sisters, the Al-Shifa Hospital, which, by the way, was the terrorists, Hamas terrorists, used the entrance of the hospital to fire our RPGs at Israeli tanks today, thereby proving, because there were embedded Western journalists, thereby proving that it really is a military base. But we knew that it would quickly be forgotten and that the Jews would be blamed for the suffering. We don't want our Palestinian brothers and sisters suffering. This was caused by an invasion of Hamas who took these 250 hostages, little babies whose diapers have to be changed, babies who have to be given bottles. Did you see the look of the mother? It wasn't even her words, which was so painful. It was the look of her face. You could see she hasn't slept in weeks. You could see the torment, the torture she's going through. And you know why her children were captured? You know why they were taken hostage? For one reason. They never harmed anyone. Israel never bothered Hamas in Gaza. They withdrew in 2005. It's because they're Jews. It's because they're Jews. It's because they're Jews. Hamas is a genocidal organization whose charter says that they will kill every Jew hiding behind every tree, every place in the world. By the way, that even includes the grandchildren of President Joe Biden, all of whose 3 children marry Jews. He has a brand new Jewish grandson born to his South African daughter-in-law, Batya Melissa Cohen Biden. So we are all at risk. And let's just remember that today it's Israel and tomorrow it's the West. Look at all of these peaceful pro-Palestinian marches that we've seen in London, that we've seen in Melbourne. Peaceful, of course, I'm saying very ironic. All of the protesters, their whole idea is intimidation. They cover their faces. They try to look scary. They burn things. They fight with the police. They break things. Find me one Jewish protest where that is done. Find me, if you see Islamists walking down the street in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane with their faces covered, do you say to yourself, you know, maybe I should cross the street? And now you see 4 or 5 Jewish people walking down the street, even holding an Israeli flag. Do you say to yourself, you know, maybe these Jews are coming. They're pretty damn scary. I'm going to cross the street. We Jews believe in peace. We have one tiny little state that is surrounded by 600 million of our Arab brothers and sisters. I could cover Israel with my finger on a map, and the rest of the Arab countries would be this large. What is it about Hamas and the Arab nations that this tiny little country bothers them? And I have to tell you, that's not the real question for people watching. The real question is, what is it about Western society, Western countries like Australia, that you can't get behind the good and evil of Hamas, taking hostages, having sex with dead women's bodies, which is the most demented, sick thing I've ever heard in my life, by the way, which the terrorists confessed to, burning whole families alive, launching this invasion. And then you blame Israel for defending itself. And then the story reverts not from the 250 hostages, not from the 1,200 murdered Israelis, but to the way that Palestinians are suffering, which they are because of Hamas, and the Jews are always blamed. We are a new generation of Jews, Rita. We don't stand for this anymore. We are not the generation of the Holocaust. We didn't have an army then. We didn't have a state then. We are proud, we are strong, and we are determined. We will not be defamed. We will not be liable. We'll fight back on the airwaves. We'll fight back in the sands of Gaza. We will fight back on social media. We will never surrender.
Well, last week you were in a very heated clash with Cenk Uygur on Piers Morgan's program over whether Israel's actions amounted to genocide against the Palestinians. The debate reached its peak when Cenk called you a bigot and a racist. Here's a bit of the exchange.
Where were you then? Why did you only come up now? In fact, when Bashar al-Assad killed 600,000 children, Arab children, when he gassed them with mustard gas, my organization took out full-page New York Times ads to protect them from sarin gas. Where were you then? You don't care about Arab children. You are a Jew hater, defined as someone who only wants to lie and say that the Jews are genocidaires. And don't try to cancel me and say that I shouldn't be on.
Rabbi, it got heated. Tell me a little bit about that debate. And you've been in plenty of these debates. Tell me about how you handle people who just scream bigot and racist at you.
Well, you know, I was the rabbi at Oxford University for 11 years. The first sign of someone losing a debate is when they scream like a lunatic, which Cenk Uygur did, when they engage in ad hominem attacks, which Cenk Uygur did. But here, much worse, when they begin to level the most disgusting anti-Semitic tropes against Jews, which Cenk Uygur did, saying that we Jews are genocidaires, we just want to slaughter Palestinians, we enjoy it, we love showing machismo and bravado over the Palestinians in order to prove how powerful. I mean, we are the people of the book. We only have an army because we learned from the Holocaust that we have no choice. But since guys like Cenk, they love this kind of militaristic jingle. Let me just be clear. What Iger experienced in our debate was a digital decapitation. He came across as someone utterly ignorant. He kept on screaming, "Why don't you Jews? It's always you Jews, by the way. Why don't you Jews give the Palestinians a state?" And I told him, "Why don't we give them a state?" I said, "Cenk, do me a favor. Before you do a debate, just read a Wikipedia page. Palestinians were offered 1936, the Peel Commission, their own state, turned it down. 1947, UN Partition Plan, turned it down. 1967, after Israel conquered Judea, Samaria, and the West Bank, offered a state, turned it down. 2000, Yasser Arafat, Bill Clinton, Ehud Barak, turned it down. 2008, Mahmoud Abbas and Ehud Olmert, 97% of Judea and Samaria, and the Temple Mount turned it down. They have always turned it down because our Palestinian brothers and sisters, sadly, do not want a two-state solution, Rita. They want a final solution.
Rabbi, we've got students here in Victoria being urged to participate in a school walkout in support of Palestine. A group called Free Palestine Melbourne is behind this, and this School Students for Palestine walkout is being planned for November 23. It would be fair to say, Rabbi, that despite what Hamas inflicts on their own people and what they inflicted on the Israelis, they are winning the PR war when it comes to young people. You see this not just here in Australia, but in the UK, in the US, there seems to be a significant percentage of youngsters who are siding with the Palestinian cause and in many cases being useful idiots for Hamas.
Rita, students unfortunately experience what we call underdogma. They automatically, without any knowledge and out of sheer ignorance, decide who's the weaker party, who's the underdog, let's support the underdog. So they think that Israel has this vast military and the poor Palestinians, they have nothing to eat and they have no hospitals. Precisely the opposite is true. The Jews are 6 million, surrounded by 600 million Arabs, oil-rich Arabs. Not one of these Arab states has taken even one refugee evacuee from Gaza. You know, and you had just last week in Saudi Arabia, you had an Arab conference to discuss the plight of the Palestinians. Why don't any of these Melbourne students who are about to walk out, why didn't they ask a single Arab country to take in even one Palestinian baby as an evacuee? Just one, take in one. They won't take 10, they won't take 20. They don't want them because they're not interested in Palestinian lives. They're interested in condemning Israel. And it's very easy to prove. Do you know that one of the people who was invited to attend this conference to save the Palestinians in Riyadh was Bashar al-Assad, who killed 600,000 Arabs? I'm sorry to chuckle at that because it's so tragic. It would be comical if it were not tragic. Let me repeat this. At the conference to save Arab lives, they invited Bashar al-Assad, the greatest murderer of Arab lives in the modern world. He was there condemning Israel. That tells you everything you need to know.
Absolutely.
So if the kids in Melbourne really want to care, walk out on Syria, protest what's happening, what Hamas is doing to Arab children, protest what all the Arab countries are doing, brutalizing their people, no democracy, no freedom of press. There isn't one democracy in the Arab world. Australia, can you remember you're a democracy and kind of be on the side of the people who believe in freedom and stop this nonsense? Because Australia is humiliating itself before the world.
Rabbi Shmuley, thank you so much for your time today. Joining me now is GB News presenter Darren Grimes. Darren, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has sacked Home Secretary Suella Braverman, a key member of his cabinet. This is in response to her public criticism of the police's handling of pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli marches. This comes as she went against Sunak's stance by publishing a piece in the Times last week calling out the perception of two-tiered policing. It's much more than mere perception, Darren. We've seen the police be heavy-handed and almost Orwellian in arresting people for being upset by Palestinian flags in the streets. But you see these lawless protesters defacing property and chanting for genocide, and they're given a pass.
Absolutely. Rita, Suella Braverman was absolutely right in her assessment. I wonder if she has a crystal ball that she polished to perfection, because everything that she wrote about last week and warned about last week came true. Over the weekend, we saw the Machine Gun Corps War Memorial be desecrated by those holding and waving Palestinian flags, wrapping our monuments around with the Palestinian flag. And it just smacked of ingratitude for a nation that has given them so much as well. And I just ultimately, I really think that everything she's warned about, whether that be multiculturalism, whether that be two-tier policing, Rita, whether that be the fact that in Britain, law and order seems to be very much stacked against those who aren't politically correct. But if you are politically correct, well, the law doesn't apply to you. It just smacks, Rita, of the kind of things that don't represent British values. And I think that's what's under attack here. It's British values.
Well, in a twist that not many saw coming, former British PM David Cameron is set to make a shock return as Rishi Sunak's new Foreign Secretary. Can you tell me about that? And is that going to see the Tories be re-elected? Is that going to help Rishi out?
I mean, is Malcolm Turnbull going to come back and save the Liberal Party in Australia? I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. You know, is Joe Biden going to save the Democrats in the US? It's not looking likely. You know, David Cameron is a turd you can't flush, and it's a mighty posh turd at that, Rita. I think ultimately what Suella Braverman's sacking and David Cameron's return actually mark is actually, it's more than a cabinet reshuffle, right? This is a flagrant betrayal of the Brexit spirit, right?
Oh,
Britain is having a case of deja vu that we just don't want to have. It's like opening a time capsule, Rita, just to find in stale old biscuits when actually you wanted some gold or something like that. I just think in our vote for Brexit, we voted to reject the kind of Davos liberalism that David Cameron actually represents, right? That was roundly rejected again in 2016 and in 2019. 2016, of course, being the referendum. Now, the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson became a beacon of hope for those of us craving actual change. But now I'm afraid it's shamelessly backpedaled into a cosy liberalist elitist roots. And it's a slap in the face, frankly, to every voter who was disillusioned by hollow promises, the kind that Suella Braverman, dare I say, doesn't make. She actually speaks the truth. And Rita, she was sacked for speaking the truth. And they dared to believe in a robust national conservatism that has now, I'm afraid, been flatly rejected. And it's Braverman's ousting and Cameron's eerie resurgence, right, that actually are a glaring testament to the Tory leadership's abandonment of core principles, right? It's a staggering retreat back into bland patrician liberalism of the kind that the Brexit referendum so decisively rejected. And all of these things, I mean, he represents, Rita, a social liberalism that talked about hijabs, wearing a hijab covered in poppies, the kind of poppies that we've seen vilified on the streets of London this last weekend. How did that go? How did that multiculturalism go, Rita? Well, you tell me. You look on the streets at those wearing Hamas headbands on our streets today, and the fact that those war memorials that I spoke of were desecrated in such a blatant way, the disrespect, the sheer disrespect for those who fought and died so that these scumbags could be free to do that on the streets of London. And you tell me that multiculturalism has been an overwhelming success story.
Well, you mentioned the poppy sellers. Let's just have a look at some volunteers selling poppies on Remembrance Day weekend at London's Victoria Station who were swamped by a pro-Palestinian protest and had to move their stand. Let's have a quick look. You can see they have to keep moving as the protest grows and find a new spot. Police apparently later intervened as the volunteers who were raising funds for a veterans charity. I mean, Darren, it really just paints such a grim picture of how things are in the UK. I'd argue, Darren, it is far worse there than it is here in Australia or the US. Your so-called conservatives are the weakest of the lot. You were just talking about what's happening in the Tories. This is happening after more than a decade of Tory rule, where you saw Boris win that landslide, speaking like a conservative, but then even he governed like he was in the Labor Party or some sort of mad green element of the Labor Party, and it hasn't got much better since.
Absolutely not. I mean, Britain is the canary in the coal mine, Rita, on this, I'm afraid to say. And this is a damning indictment of the state of Britain today. And, you know, we mentioned how bad it is elsewhere. I mean, what we saw outside of the Sydney Opera House, for example, with the blatant and open anti-Semitism. But I think you're right. What we see here is it's just so widespread in Britain. We've been accepting net migration figures of over 600,000 people net a year. That's, you know, thanks to idiots like Tony Blair and David Cameron. But you're totally right to say that 13 years the Conservatives have been in power. It's not just been David Cameron. We've accepted a load of people into the country who, frankly, don't share our values and would quite like us to be another country altogether. I mean, I'm reminded of a Policy Exchange, a think tank report back in 2016, a while ago now, so I imagine it's even worse, in which it found that 40% of British Muslims were said to be supportive of aspects of Sharia law in place of British law. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that that says something about the multiculturalism project that the political and media class have waxed lyrical about being an unmitigated success story that has actually been an unmitigated disaster for Britain and for the Western world. There was also a veteran, Rita, and it broke my heart. I felt really angry seeing this story. There was a veteran called Jim Henderson, Scottish bloke, and he described being kicked and punched in his back and side as he fought to get the money he'd been collecting for the Poppy appeal out of Edinburgh's Waverley Station, a major train station in Britain. And eventually the station staff had to step in and rescue him. That was during a Palestinian occupation. If you ask me, it's a damn disgrace. And now we found ourselves in the position where these people think they're above the law. And that's what Suella Braverman was trying to address. Those are the very issues that she was speaking of that are the cause of two-tier policing, where these people on our streets think that they are totally above the law. It simply does not apply to them. Now, of course, there are other videos that we've seen as well, that two-tier policing being totally evident in those. We had right-wing activists taken to the street, but I actually think a lot of those right-wing activists, Rita, felt compelled to defend the cenotaph, which is perhaps, for those who don't know, the nation's, it's our symbol, it's where we go to pay our respects, our national monument of remembrance, where it's our focus for that day of remembrance. And that's all we wanted, Rita. We just wanted one weekend to remember those young boys and men who died so that Britain could be free, and the rest of Europe, it has to be said. And they couldn't even give us that, Rita. I don't think these protests should have been allowed to go ahead, frankly. I think it was an affront to everything we hold dear.
And yeah, those war monuments being vandalised on Remembrance Day, it really is a grim set of circumstances in the UK, and you do wonder what's going to happen next. Last question, given the state of the Tories, could Suella Braverman challenge for the leadership? Could there be a late change before the election?
Look, Suella Braverman speaks our language. When she was polled, her speech was polled last week, and 75% of Conservative voters, so they're the voters that Rishi Sunak needs to try and keep on side. It's not looking likely because the Labour Party are storming ahead 20 points in the polls. And Suella Braverman, 75% of the Conservative vote said, yep, I agree with what she's saying. She's bang on everything that she said. And I think that's important to remember. And right now, we're seeing letters of no confidence in Rishi Sunak's leadership going in to the 1922 committee, which is a committee that actually represents the backbench of the Conservative Party, the ruling party in Britain. And I think there is going to be real trouble. I think there are going to be splits within that party because Rishi Sunak has decided to prioritise Davos over Darlington. And I'm afraid to say that that is a complete betrayal of the 2019 coalition that Suella Braverman speaks the language of. So more power to her, Rita. She's one of us, and you should get her on one day because she absolutely is bloody brilliant, if you ask me.
Well, I hope she challenges and the electorate actually has a choice at the electorate and they're not just picking between Labor and Labor Light. Darren Grimes, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Rita.
That's it from me. I'll see you Friday night for the Rita Panahi Show and, of course, always Sunday morning for Outsiders.